channel, and I've got a fantastic interview that I know that you're all really going to enjoy. I spoke to Chris Shaw on St. Patrick's Day, and you'll be able to tell because I'm wearing a green shirt during the interview. He's a really interesting chap. He's an award-winning author. As a boy, he experienced World War II from the home front, went to some boarding schools, got some interesting stories about that one. Went on to travel the world and author 9 books, and his books have won some awards, including Reader's Choices Awards. So we discussed World War II. We discussed travel. We discussed boxing. We discussed love. We discussed life lessons, and had a particularly interesting discussion on how fatherlessness caused by World War II impacted on the world. Now, that might seem like an arcane subject, but I've read some social scientists who have hypothesized that the rapid change in the 1960s was directly linked to fatherlessness caused by the war. So that was a really, really, really insightful chat, because his father was absent for the entirety of the Second World War, and it impacted on him. So we are going to discuss all of his books, but the books that he's written are also broadly themed on things that we've just discussed. But enough from me. Let's hear from Chris. Few people, if I can make the observation, have experienced war, private school in the United Kingdom, although I'd imagine that's not all that bad. It helped formulate your character and the person that you are now. 7 years in the Caribbean, and numerous adventures in Australia, overseas, and have written about it. Can we discuss the books you've written, the lessons you've learned, and your quite interesting life story?
Well, let's start perhaps at the beginning. Born on the east coast of England in 1939, January. And if you examine that date, you will see it is pre-World War II. And I think the family joke is that I could say Messerschmitt before I could say Daddy. And there's a bit of a hidden trap in that. All of us of that age had no fathers for 6 years. We grew up in a feminine world, a mothering world, a nurturing world, and most of the boys became mummy's boys. Put my hand up, true. So at the end of the war, after having experienced bombing and doodlebugs, and if you don't know about doodlebugs, you can Google doodlebugs, and I didn't think I could say that. My father came home from war, and then I got a sister, and then I was sent away to boarding school, all of which makes me sound like a victim, but I certainly wasn't. But it was a very, very strange world to evolve in. There was no fear about the war. We were too young to understand war. We were too protected from the bombs, the explosions, all the rest of the stuff, dogfights in the sky and whatever. We were too protected by our mothers to have any fear, anxiety on an ongoing basis. Then, by a total freak of nature in the universe, I got a scholarship to this, what you call a private school, we call a public school. And in the 1950s, I have to tell you that it was somewhat Dickensian. And if you watched Oliver Twist,
yes,
you know the stone and the coldness, the very strong discipline, and the very full days of, albeit, sport, learning, army, whatever. Very little time to spare. 39 bells per day controlled our behavior when we did what. I later learned about Pavlov and his dogs, a Russian physiologist. There are some very interesting equalities there. Yeah. And it taught discipline, basically, and which means that I can out-discipline anybody because of all that cold water, I won't say bullying, but there was a natural tendency. It was an all-boys school, so there was a natural tendency for child
setting up of hierarchies. Yeah.
Hierarchy, imposed hierarchy, shall we say. But I came out of there having grown up in a single lane village with a church at the top, which was called Church Lane. We Anglo-Saxons are not very creative, I'm afraid. Into being sort of fairly well-rounded character.
May I jump in and ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, no.
I want to interflow. I don't want to interrupt the flow too much, but obviously your story, I would imagine that you're kind of familiar with telling it, considering that you're a published author, and I enjoy and recommend your books. We'll get onto that in a moment. There's some real discussions I've read somewhere, and they're more hypothesis than anything else, that one of the reasons there was a massive change in the 1960s and a massive feminine backlash and massive everything else is because of the fatherlessness caused by the Second World War, both the absence of the men that survived and came back, but quite, as we know, large amounts of the men didn't. And some of the men, reading Germaine Greer, her father was a survivor of the war, and she indicates, and to give her a degree of credit, not in a totally pejorative way, that her father just spent massive amounts of time apparently literally sitting in the corner and staring at the walls. And so he was physically there, but he wasn't present, if you understand what I mean.
I understand that, yes.
Yeah, and there's a big hypothesis that a lot of the social change, some positive and some negative, because we always focus on the positive side of things. But really, frankly, there was a lot of negative things that happened, and the fatherlessness was part of it. And there's some questioning now in regards to, feminism in so much as it can be defined. And I've had some magnificent conversations. I know you've looked on my site too, thank you, with some feminists, and we always struggle to say what it is. But some people describe it as the absence of men and describing them as a good thing. All that is a contextual background to, would you mind discussing how that played out for you, what it meant, and what you think about those subjects? How did the war and fatherlessness affect you and your generation?
That's a really hard one, because it affected families primarily through the mothers, of course. They had been the homemakers. They'd had to hold the whole thing together in the absence of their husbands, with all the fear and the lack of money and all that stuff. And they were working on the land and doing men's jobs, mechanics, aircraft mechanics, loaders of ammunition and whatever. And of course, a 1930s, 1920s, 1910 even, born husbands came home with the same attitude that they took away. But the world had changed, and the women had done all these things and not just been nurses and secretaries and whatever they were supposed to be. So there was a considerable backlash from the ladies who were not about to be taken over, and the Victorian ethos of male-dominated society. They put their little fingers up and said, "Excuse me, no," for possibly the first time in 100 years or more. And then along came a new generation, my generation, with Flower Power and Pot and the Beatles and Zen and all the rest of the stuff. There's an interesting personal thing here in that my mother played piano and taught piano, and she wanted to teach me piano. but it became very obvious that this was yet another controlling feature. So I decided to learn the violin. So I was quite successful at this. I have to say, I led the school orchestra all the time I was there, won prizes and da-da-da-da. But, of course, she asked me the last time I went home when she was about 101, do you still play the violin? And I said, no, I don't. And she got quite upset about that whole thing because she had worked very hard to get me to do this. But the revolution had come along, and the violin had its strings all snapped, all four of them, only to become a guitar. And it was the guitar revolution. If you think of the Beatles and et al., the guitar ruled the roost. And she had no idea that there had been this incredible revolution in music, and that I was no longer the chief violinist or even a soloist. There was just too much competition for that to happen, and the whole thing just swung around. So post-war was really interesting. It didn't start livening up until maybe 1958, 59 into the 60s. And this was London I'm talking about now, of course. And we still had rationing up until 1952, I think. Yeah. It was tight. It was, there weren't any fat people about at all. We had to grow our own vegetables in the back garden and so on and so forth. But anyway, along came the guitars, along came the bands, along came the groups and the pot and all the rest of the stuff. And that was the revolution.
Can you discuss both the positive and the negatives again? Because it's really looked back on it, and it's become incredibly politicized. I can understand why. People kind of like people who are inclined to the left, like, oh, magnificent times, the best of times is this magnificent progress. And undoubtedly there was magnificent progress in some areas. But now we're starting to look back on it and kind of think, well, considering that, especially, and I'm coming back to fatherlessness for a reason, because I've just come out of the Queensland Police Service, and disproportionately a lot of the social issues that I dealt with, I felt anecdotally, and it's backed up to a certain degree, and there are certain qualifications to that, by the literature, that a lot of these problems are caused by fatherlessness. And I don't think it's any coincidence that you had the massive, swift, revolutionary change that one had in the 60s, and the fact that there were no men present. So I'd really like to, if you don't mind, and I know it's not planned, but I really wouldn't mind delving into your perspective and your experience of this, how it's played out both in the positive and the negative. Again, without being judgmental, it's like, it's not.
Yeah, well,
you can make a definitive judgment.
No, my societal and cultural, societal experience is reasonably limited, because in 1965 I moved out of London. I'd been there for 3 years and I hated every minute of it because I'm a country boy. And there's discussion now about there is a real change in the personality of country boys going to the city and vice versa. You just change. The negative revolution, of course, to this fatherlessness was that we had experienced all this war stuff, and along came the Cold War with Russia.
Mm.
And we are saying, no more. We do not want this.
Mm.
That's when there became the juxtaposition of the necessity of deterrence versus the real wish for there to be no more war. So the ban the bomb thing came up, and it was a huge movement. I was in London, and it was the beginning of Beatles and whatever. When was I there? 62 to 65.
Did you go to the cave? I've got to ask, did you actually see them, or was it just like the time that we're talking about?
I saw some of them. I saw some of them. Yeah, I saw the Stones, saw the Beatles, also saw Oscar Peterson and Ella Fitzgerald in concert. She was wearing a ginger wig, and that is just so good. So good. Yeah, all of this stuff was available if you had the money, but I was on fairly short shift for that. It was all positive as far as I was concerned, but that was all the music scene, Mary Quant and King's Road, and all the new fashionista styles, and it was all uphill, and it was all gorgeous, and there was lots of money around, and it was all a huge, huge boost in trade, basically.
Churchill's broad sunlit uplands come through.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it just was on this huge rise in the graph, the amount of trade. And husbands came home and pretty much took up where they left off in their jobs, and it was probably fairly soon after that they realized they were totally left behind. So they either had to take more courses or whatever and go up the ladder, or they got left behind and got a bit bitter and twisted, I do have to say, having saved the country and whatever.
Yeah. You know, and a chap totally understands that too. Like, you know, imagine that, because like that would be a hiatus. That war period would have been a high. I mean, if you're a professional soldier, it would have been like, great, this is what I've been training for all these years. But the vast majority of people fighting weren't professional soldiers; they were citizen soldiers.
They were carpenters and leckies and whatever,
and they didn't want to be there.
They didn't want to be there.
They were doing it because they had to. So you're kind of like thinking, well, this is this hiatus in my life, and I'm going to, like, okay, I left here, and I'm going to come back, and inshallah, God willing, it's going to be the same kind of thing. And by the way, I've been through hell, so, you know, let's pay me a little bit of respect here.
Yes.
And not like
they sort of got left behind.
Yeah.
They sort of got left behind, unless they actively tried to work their way up the ladder of wherever they happened to be. And if they were entrepreneurial, which very few POMs are, they're workers, they're shopkeepers. Napoleon said so.
Yeah, he's shopkeepers. Well, he made another observation too, but we'll leave that bit out.
Okay. Yeah, it was difficult times for them, really difficult times. And that would reflex back on the family.
Of course.
And so the children that left home to go to college, university, or whatever, had a completely different outlook to their parents. So there would have been a bigger than average gap, not gender gap, teenage gap with their parents than would otherwise have been. That's probably another side effect, I think.
All very interesting. Okay, so I mean, looking back now in the in the year of our Lord 2023, so was it all? I don't know. It was imposed, but this idea of women taking all those roles and being forced to, and men feeling slightly, I suppose, marginalised, which would be a strange thing to say. Like, how has that played out for society generally, and both men, women, and children? Like,
I don't know. Not being a sociologist, I really can't answer that properly, except to say that I think Germaine Greer was a very clever lady who grabbed hold of that gap and said, hey, there is a gap here. And rather than the ladies being left behind and trampled underfoot a la Queen Victoria et al., let us see if we can't elevate their status.
Quite so, yeah, and not unreasonably. Again, it's for complete clarity. I'm sure I don't need to say that to listeners of Northern Vibe and to my many feminist guests who have come on. Like, I'm not against that. I'm just making an observation of a dynamic.
Having switched to the class system and your experiences in Papua New Guinea, in 1965, at the age of, what was I? 26, I think. Yeah, 26. I went to the Caribbean to work. And I was based in Trinidad and Tobago, in Port of Spain. And I found colonialism. I had no idea about it. I'd been living in London, and I found it, and I walked in, and there was, admittedly, now you see there's the difference here. If you're thinking Jamaica, you're thinking basically African Jamaicans. If you're thinking Trinidad, you've got Africans, Indians, Chinese, Europeans, right? So it's a mixed bunch, a really mixed bunch. But there was this, a little bit of this. And I thought to myself, this is not right.
That's not healthy.
Do this. I cannot do this. I'm an Englishman, not an Australian. You have a lead on this. And I have had the class system. So my determination was to have full respect unless the opposition decided they didn't want that. They wanted disrespect. So my 7 years there, where things had changed very, very much between 65 and 72, socially, Black Panthers came down from New York and tried to exert some political pressure and stuff like this. Did I have racist views against me? Yes, I was spat on in the streets occasionally, shouted at and sworn at and whatever. But hey, it's what it was. They were not reacting to me. They were reacting to the whole political thing for a couple of 100 years or whatever. Slaves brought, plantations, all that sort of stuff that's going on at the moment. I had basically no problem at all with racism, apart from the odd street attack. But no, I had really good friends. I had good communicators. I had really good drinking buddies until I got married, and then that was a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, but I think the sense of humour which comes through your writing, and you discussed, and you stated, was kind of like assisted you in your tough schooling days too. That would have helped.
Yeah. Well, you got to do that, and you've got to learn from them. It took me 18 months to learn how to speak Jamaican, but I was only going there for 5 weeks at a time. But it's a very difficult, man. The greeting is "I'm on one." I'm on one. And you go, what is that? What does that mean? How, man? How you doing? What happened? All right? What happened? Oh, man, what's happening? What's going on? Hello, how are you? What's going on?
Yeah.
In the English parlance. So there you go. But yes, you learn to do that.
It's the same thing in, I was stationed in the Torres Straits for a couple of years. And incidentally, I found, because I hadn't spoken Papua New Guinea Pidgin for years, and I didn't really know all that much when I was a kid, like just basically street stuff. But I found the cadence and the lilt of the language helped me pick up a little bit there. And the greeting in Torres Strait Creole is "which way?" which is a generic, it's a generic question, and it's really kind of funny, but it's used in other contexts too. So it's like you say, "Hey, which way, Matt?" "Ah, same way, follow, I'm good," like, whatever. But you can, because it's a generic question. So it's like, if you want to ask where someone is, this way, you know, which way, Chris? Where am?
My publisher, whose name is Ocean Reeve, who's in Brisbane, and he runs a full publishing house with printing facilities and stuff. And he's a lovely bloke. That's my bio. Those are little cottontail tamarins, and that's a bio. Yes. I ran a dinner for the 150th anniversary of Framlingham College in the Hunter Valley. And we had 59 people turn up, including the Wizard of Christchurch, who was one of ours, 5 or 6 people from UK, some Kiwis, and people from all over. And it was just brilliant. We had a whole weekend there. There was a lot of golf, huge amount of wine drinking and stuff like that. And it was really nice. I did a book on that, but I haven't got one here. Talking about my father, that's what he did.
I say.
HMS Warspite in the Mediterranean. It was a battleship. They don't have battleships any longer. Cruise missiles instead. But he did a stint there. Yeah, that was where he was, 6 years or thereabouts. My writing was kicked off by my lovely wife, Rebecca. She was reading an author by the name of Derek Longden, who comes from Yorkshire in England. And they've got terribly dry senses of humour, those guys. And he would write little stories about his home life and his cats and his blind wife, who is also an author. And they were really, really funny. And she would laugh and giggle when she was reading them. And so I banned her from reading them on public transport or in bed. Now, isn't that an interesting statement for me to make in the light of current stuff? I banned her. Listen to that. In truth and in fact, we've had a 30-year relationship with no arguments at all. The banning was a mutual understanding of why this should happen, and it was totally accepted, no problem. And I thought to myself, well, if Derek Longden, a Yorkshire man, can write a story that makes her laugh, maybe I could too. And I wrote a little story called Happy Anniversary. We had 3 cats at the time, and I just made up a story about the 3 cats. And it made her laugh, and I got applause from that. And there is nothing stronger for motivation than a little bit of an applause and some stroking. So I continued writing. And I think the 3rd book I wrote was called Hey Guys, Here's How You Get More Nookie, which was designed as a fishing bait to bring in the blokes, to say, well, that's a really good idea. How do I do that? It's actually trying to teach blokes what women actually want from a serious relationship with their man, whether married or partnered, it doesn't matter at all. And you say to the bloke, what does your wife want? And he'll give a little bit of a grin and a, hey, yeah, righto. And they're totally wrong. The 3 priorities for ladies, and you can do this as a party trick, trust me. They need respect, which equals trust. They need communication, and they need security. Now, you can write that down, and any audience, you can challenge the ladies. What are the 3 things that you want most out of your serious relationship with a bloke? And this is specifically blokes, because I don't think it pertains to lesbians. And they will say, you're a man, you can't possibly know this thing. And so you show them
Like
this.
you were channeling me. I was going to say, what precisely qualifies you to say this with such confidence, Chris? But sorry, I was going to
Divorce.
precisely qualifies you to say this with the degree of confidence that you seem to be asserting these things, Chris. But do go on.
A divorce.
Oh.
I got it wrong. I didn't do all the right things. So I made it my business to find out what it was. And a million words with your next wife will sort that out very nicely. And I thought this information is too good to hold on to. So I sort of wrote it all down, and that was the book that came out of it. That was the first book with the little happy anniversary story in it, which incidentally was published in the Weekend Australian, a little time later. That was the only other one that is of real significance. My New Country, which was about, that was the only other, the trials and tribulations of a Trinidad wife, a 3-month-old boy child, and myself as a homme via Caribbean coming to Australia and living in Clifton Beach.
Obviously, the lessons that you've learnt through life are related to the books, but would you mind discussing some of these books?
Lessons of life. Change is never comfortable. I think we know that.
Mm-hmm.
If you think equality of people in law is the same as equality of people in social situations, I give you a male and a female bathroom and leave it at that.
Mm. Yeah.
What else in marriage guidelines I've done? It's her house. It's your home. She will turn the house into a home if you've got a good wife.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be okay. Do not start making decisions that affect the interior or whatever of the house or the children or the food or whatever unless you are asked, right? Her home, her cave, which she dominates.
Mm.
You're allowed to live there. You earn the money to get the mortgage down, and she may well join you in that, and that's good news, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, so that's that. Respect, communication, and security we've done. I've met 1 million or more people in my life. More, much more. And the thing which strikes me most is the sameness of people given an equitable environment. I maintain that if you take a potato farmer from Idaho in the United States, where they grow an awful lot of potatoes, you've heard of Idaho potatoes, you take him over to Georgia, which is not the state of Georgia, this is in Russia, the country in Russia, to a potato farmer there, and you put these two guys together, the one only speaks Russian and the other only speaks English, and they've got no chance of communicating verbally, then they will communicate and do it well.
Mm.
The samenesses of people is much more amazing than the differences of people. The first one was...
I've got the screen up, Chris, if you
The
like.
Imposter. Very good. The Imposter, yes. I had an Auntie Gwen who got pregnant at the same stage as my mother did with me in 1938. She lost her child. Her husband was my mother's brother, and they were very close friends, these two. And so she lost her child, and then she lost her husband, who was a pilot in Blenheim Bombers. So one of those knocking is very fierce. Two of those is almost life-defining. So I wanted at one stage of the game, I don't know where it came from, I wanted at one stage of the game to write her a happier life. It happened in World War I instead of World War II, in fact. He became a sniper, not a pilot. He got a very strange identity problem at the end of the war. And did he get back together with his wife or not? We shall find out when we read the book. For whatever reason, I woke up one morning wondering how you spelt the word that described the sound of a boxing glove hitting a jaw at speed. I sat down after getting the obligatory morning coffee and the morning pharmaceuticals to get we oldies to smile and stay upright for the day, and sat down and said and wrote SHUG exclamation mark shug, another one of those onomatopoeic words, and I could see the glove, the chin, the lights, the black ceiling, and the spray of sweat. And so I described that, and 3 months later I had a book. Amazing. And I had that. Stephen King said, "I am the stenographer of my imagination." Now, my opus, magnum opus, open that up, you will find the book, which is 25 stories of the mums and dads, as I was saying earlier on.
Yeah.
Lots of tears in the writing. Fair amount of tears in the reading too. Stories out of my head, but it took 2.5 years because I had no understanding of Gallipoli, why we were there, who else was there, what we were trying to achieve, who were we fighting, and why. And also the fact that the military people, military historians, and the war correspondents tease that pretty much where everybody was, of the 10 nationalities that were there, everybody was on any given day. So this had to be researched. So my stories fitted into it. The other barrier I had was that of those 10 nationalities, the men were from a century ago. The households were a century ago. So the cultural context was a century ago. You want to find out how much work that is involved in that? Write a story of a couple in Newfoundland, St. John's in Newfoundland, whose son went away to Gallipoli and survived that and went to the First World War. That's what I had to do. So you could actually walk into the house. I could walk into the house in my head and be quite at home there a century ago. No, what's going on. So it took 2.5 years of background to do that, to fit my little stories in. The mums were calling out to me to tell their stories. And it's not only that it's Gallipoli, you see, because Ukraine and Russia are going through exactly the same things with mums and dads having lost their children in this war, which is going on this minute. So it's wartime throughout history condensed into a little story, a few little stories about Gallipoli.
So that's fundamentally what his books are about, and I haven't read all of them. I must declare I'm just about to finish one. I really do enjoy his writing style, as you can tell from the interview and from talking to him. He's a very engaging writer, and he draws people into the story. So that's the thing I like the most, and those insights in regards to how fatherlessness played out. It's such an important issue, and I think it's something that we kind of forget about a lot. Thanks very much to everyone who's liked and commented. Big g'day to you, Chris McLaughlin. And I'll see you all next week. Please like, please share, please follow Northern Vibe, both here on YouTube and